Check. There. Maybe I can do that.
This is much easier. Trying to juggle the phone and the box.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Bevan Hernandez, and I'm a member of the Elements Planning Committee. I need to talk into my box here. I'd like to welcome you to the session titled Shipping on Time and on Budget Without Compromising on Flexibility. I'm really looking forward to this. Being a longtime project manager, I am really excited to see exactly what Scott has to say this morning. Just a few reminders before we begin. Please turn off your cell phones or turn them to mute. We do encourage tweeting, live tweeting and Facebooking, but if you can make them silent, that would be great. And the evaluation form that you fill out, please do that and turn that in at the end of the sessions. We give this feedback to the speakers, and it's really important. So without further ado, as I fiddle with my technology here, I'd like to introduce you to Scott Woods. He is the president of Westra, which is a custom software development company based in downtown State College, Pennsylvania. He received his bachelor's in computer science from Penn State. Over the years, Westra has grown quickly and steadily with 10 outstanding employees and clients around the country. In addition to building custom workflow applications for their clients, they contribute to the community through mentorship, apprenticeship, and entrepreneurship efforts. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Scott. Thank you.
Evan. All right. Morning, everyone. So, a little bit of background on Westra, the software development company. We're a completely custom shop, so all of our projects come to us from various types of clients. Frequently, we find out our portfolio stays relatively diverse. So there's not one particular industry that we focus on. And what that means for us is we get to see a huge range of possible projects and a huge range of teams and stakeholders that we're working with. A couple examples of the type of work that we do so that you can see in part from where the experience I'll be speaking of comes from is example of a recent project is for Frac Tracker. And this was really interesting. It combined data gathering with visualization. And this was a project to explore and map all of the leases associated with oil and gas in Allegheny County. And it connected all the relationships between those. And this is the first time that the data had ever really been seen before, since before this it had been kind of locked up in county deeds offices. We've also built Spock. This is the web application that manages the operations for events for the university police. And we have Flip Learning, where we did all the original development on this. And this is a successful ed tech startup. Provides a rich alternative to textbooks. So this is a large interactive web applications that's run at many universities now. So Westra, we are also recently certified as a B Corporation, as a benefit corporation. So this means we tend to pick projects that try and do some sort of greater good. We also contribute extensively to the community through many different projects and nonprofit organizations. We want to try and find meaning in our work. So out of curiosity, how many people work with an internal team and kind of a dedicated product owner? In other words, you're building software for your own team or for your own organization. Okay, about half. What about external teams, like Westra, where we're building software, but we're really building it for a client or a product owner that's outside of our organization? Is anybody doing that? Okay, great. And then how many people use a methodology like Scrum or Kanban? Kind of, okay, great. So you have some experience with those. Okay. Let's talk about what makes it difficult to get custom projects to come together on time. And this is a key part of our business, and it's obviously a key part of your organizations as well. We want to be able to deliver projects on time in our budgets, but we don't want to be draconian about it. Like one way to get things to deliver on time and on budget is just to simply say no to everything. But then, of course, you wind up with a project it's really not nearly as satisfying for everyone, and you don't wind up with good software. So there's a lot of emphasis, I feel like, on process. You know, we talk a lot about process. We talk a lot about features and technology. Those are important, but what we feel is that it's important. A lot of times we run into trouble if we don't step back at even a higher level And that's even awareness of what it is that we're trying to accomplish here, awareness of how difficult this problem actually is, or where the complexity lies. So this diagram is a concept called the stages of competence. And we love this concept. The idea behind it is that for any given subject matter, we all start at unconscious incompetence. This is where we're doing something new. Let's say you're learning how to play tennis. You don't even know the things that you're screwing up at this point. You're doing things wrong, and you don't even realize that there's a certain technique that you have that's just completely off the chart. And what happens is, over time, with a coach, you can achieve conscious incompetence, and you move up a level. And this is great. This is where you realize it's like, oh, that's what I've been doing wrong. I need to work on this aspect of my backhand. Or we as a team need to work on how we do our retrospectives. Or we as a team need to work on estimation. So that's the spark of where you go from not knowing what you're doing wrong to knowing what you're doing wrong. As a result of that, most of the time you move fairly naturally over into conscious competence. It may take some time, but you go from saying, I know what I'm doing wrong, you naturally work on it, and you get better, and you go to conscious competence. And that's the point at which you say, we know why we're doing this right. We've worked hard on it. And then finally, sometimes what happens is these things get to be such second nature, you don't even think about it anymore. Things that used to be something that your team worked on internally at getting better at become something that you remember. It's just like, that used to be a big deal. We don't even think about it anymore. And that's unconscious competence, both kind of for better or for worse. So the interesting thing is what we strive for. You want to strive for conscious incompetence. That's really what we're shooting for. Because it's like the things that you already know about, those are not the things that are holding us back, for having our projects perform better. It's the things that we're not even aware of. And so conceptually, one of the big important consciousness is how we frame the whole problem of software development and web development and mobile development. We frame it in these ways. Have you noticed that there's so many different analogies that get tossed around for what project management is like, or what web development management is like? You'll see things where people say it's like ordering a product, or it's like ordering food, or it's like building a house. And I don't know about all of you, but I feel like all the analogies that I generally hear are terrible. And in fact, they give the illusion of too much control over the final product. For example, we feel like with architecture or with building, there's so many patterns that are involved in architecture. You can literally do a fairly good job of planning the thing out ahead of time. And the execution may have some uncertainty to it, but it's not like building a house or a car. Software, there's such a wide range of possibilities, and there's so few established patterns. There's just too much variance. So I have yet another analogy, because the analogies, I think, are helpful for framing the problem and relating it to something. I'm not going to say it's the greatest analogy, but basically what I think the other ones get wrong is we need greater emphasis on the journey. Not so much the fact of like, oh, here's the process or here's the destination, but the fact that actually the hardest part of it is the nature of what that journey is like. So my definition of adventure is uncertain outcome. And that should also be the way that we approach these software projects. There's too much certainty as to how this is going to turn out in the end. So my analogy is that custom software is like heading out through the wilderness and trying to find the best possible spot for your campsite or your vacation. It could wind up being a simple or a complex sort of result. It could be the best experience you've ever had, or it could just be plain awful. But the thing is, it's largely up to you and your team, and it's going to require a team to do it. An out-of-the-box solution would be something like going to the Best Western or the Motel 8 or the Ritz. It may be good, it may be bad, but largely when we buy software or web applications or leverage a lot of that, it is largely a lot of predetermined outcome. So in our journey, we have to imagine that we can't see very far. We have a terrible map, and the terrain is varied enough that we're going to have to make a lot of decisions on the way. So we don't really know exactly where we're going. We think that the ideal camp spot may be over across that mountain range, maybe across that mountain range. We have to make the different decisions to get there. And ultimately, this is what everybody hopes for. You want to make some good decisions and take some risks along the way. You may compromise and say, you know what, instead of rolling the dice and going way out here, we're going to plan on finding something close to the river. But it's largely a function of your teamwork and efficiency and navigation skills. So, yeah, if this all sounds kind of a little too fake and idealistic, kind of like the stock photography that revolves around hiking, then it is. It's too fake. Because unfortunately, at this point, that might have been what it was like early on. But the bar for professional software development and web development is so high now. You know, what's expected of all of us is everything's going to be highly responsive, awesome user experience, great graphic design. It shouldn't take forever. It shouldn't take a huge amount of budget. And it should accurately convey the mission of our organization. So basically, this is more what they have in mind, you know, for what we're going to need to build. You know, and this is more of the destination that everybody's shooting for. It's about 200 miles out in the wilderness, and you have to get there in one day, and the map is even worse than before. And now, of course, that you're sponsored, and this is being done professionally, and you have an entire team, you don't really get to pick out the site anymore. You know, somebody else is helping to pick it out for you. And the field is highly competitive as well. So there's a lot of money at stake. So now the journey looks a lot less like a hike, and it looks something more like this. So I think a rally car driving to the semi-predetermined destination, and it's incredibly elaborate. This is closer to the right analogy. It's an incredibly intense experience. And the cool thing about it is that there's an element of teamwork to it. If we go and look inside the rally car at how this team is operating, this is what's going on inside.
And crest 70.
So the driver
Stay
over
right
here,
over drop. And
you can
stay
hear the
right over jump
navigator
into
on the
right
left.
50. Left 70. Left 6. Left 6 tight. 4. And right 4. And crest. And left 4 tightens into turn left 2. And left 4 over crest. And over jump.
So it's interesting because they're making mistakes constantly. You know, you can watch the car veering too far off to one side. There's turns that need to be made. And the interesting thing about this is a difficult enough task, and it's complex enough, no single human mind is going to be able to handle it all. So we've completely split the responsibilities, and with complete trust, too. The navigator is 100% responsible for putting the ideas in the head of the driver well in advance of exactly how sharp that next turn's going to be. And they can't see over the next jump, but we're giving them an idea of the fact that there's going to be a right turn that's about this angle coming afterwards. And they're trying to do this under duress and adjusting to the different types of conditions. So if we think about the analogy for us, this is really similar in the sense of we have our stakeholders who are trying to give us an idea of where we need to go, even though they don't know exactly. I mean, none of us ever see a project turn out exactly like how it was originally envisioned. And likewise, the development team and the design team, we're completely subservient in terms of we have to place an incredible amount of trust that this is going to be the right path. And we have to perform very consistently. And if we take our eye off of the ball and stop performing and instead get involved heavily with the actual steering, then both teams are going to be compromised. So direct control, to some extent, is an illusion. And we really have to approach this as not one side versus the other, but as a true collaboration in the face of extreme adversity and uncertainty. And that really makes all the difference. The process and everything hinge upon that. When everybody's very professional about this and know what to expect, you get good focused concentration and execution. When you can't see where the navigator or the driver or bystanders, where they don't have the right experience for exactly how uncertain this can be, you can wind up with a whole lot of screaming instead. So that's because they had something else entirely in mind. Part of the other good analogy of this is that it's the de-emphasis on the equipment. You know, it's like you have a high-performance rally car. Our number one variable for evaluating a project should be the quality of the collaboration between the two and that level of trust and collaboration between all the different parties. The best or worst vehicle isn't going to make that much of a difference. So you could take a world-class rally team and put them in a 99 Subaru Legacy, and they're going to wind up doing awesome compared to a more dysfunctional team that might be bickering away in the high-performance rally car. So we see teams too often focusing on one technology or the other and saying, like, next project we're going to do this, or next we're going to adopt this particular platform instead of this platform. And it's going to make a difference in our productivity or make a difference in the outcome. Those things do affect particularly developer enjoyment of the process and open up some capabilities, but it's not really a big variable in terms of project management or outcome. So on our journeys today, for going through some of the experiences, part of this is opening what we feel like are I have several uncomfortable truths that we feel that we've discovered or come to agree upon about project management. None of these are really news, but the degree to which we internalize these really dictates whether or not we're really going to get from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. So here's the first uncomfortable truth, and that is we can't estimate worth a damn. When we take individual estimates, we've got about 11 years of estimation at this point, data under our belt in terms of looking at all of our individual stories and the accuracy. I don't know if anybody's ever actually done this with your team and looked at actual versus expected when you measure it on individual stories and how accurate those are. We've read so many books on estimation and all these things about how you can become a better estimator. Our accuracy at best is about 30% for a given, either direction for a given estimate, which is abysmal if you're going to use that as the foundation for your budget. So one of the big upfront things is that any given estimate is going to be wildly inaccurate. And it's not uncommon, too, for these to go 2- or 3-fold out of whack. So what can we do about it? One of the most important things is make lots of estimates. So anytime we've found ourselves in a situation where we're forced to confront like one estimate as a whole, always break it down. And the reason is twofold. A, you're going to find the things that you forgot about. B, the beautiful thing is that the number of errors tend to cancel out. So if on this particular set of estimates here, we do not think that this, which is estimated at a 2 and a 2 and a 5 and a 5, we think that these are probably going to take less time than these. But when we look at the reality, that's not necessarily the case. This one may have taken by far the most time. This one may have taken more like a 1, and this one may be right in the middle. But the good news is that what tends to happen is that as you do these over time and you add more and more to them, then all the little bits of errors start to cancel each other out. Some will be over, some will be under. But the important part is this only works if you eliminate the bias. And this is one of the really tricky parts. So point system for estimating things. How many teams use a point system for estimating as opposed to hours or dollars? Okay. So the tricky part about the point system is that it's something to be protected. It's like the uncertainty principle. The idea is that rather than estimating in dollars or hours, you ask your team to assign a given set of points of difficulty to a task. And it's funny, it's a mental game. What we're trying to do is, like, if we ask developers, every time we ask developers to estimate in terms of hours or look at something in terms of a budget of dollars, the estimates would always come out to be optimistic. And that's because ultimately, like, we want to please the person in front of us. You know, we know what the answer is supposed to be. You know, it's like if you have X amount of time left and you say, like, all right, how long is this going to take? You want to identify those situations and get everybody out of those. We saw a particular project where every estimate was done by the developers in person in front of the stakeholder. And the scope had been predetermined and the timeline had been predetermined. And we saw the client's developers in the position of estimating, and basically knowing that they pretty much had to estimate so that things would come out. And if you didn't like the answer, go back and come up with a way to modify things a little bit so you could get the answer that you liked. By observing the process, you're perturbing it. So this takes an awful lot of protection. A lot of times we find ourselves steering the product owners who have a definite need and desire to want to know the outcome, even though we can't, and telling them, like, in order for the points to be valuable, for these unbiased estimates to be valuable, they have to not have expectations attached to them. Next one that's uncomfortable. Nobody knows precisely what you should build. And so this is the other side of the coin. And this is from our product owners and stakeholders. All the time we will, you'll wind up with projects where it feels like everything's fairly well mapped out in the beginning. But every single project that we work on, the scope winds up changing fairly significantly throughout the course of the project. And this is a good thing. Ideally, you are changing your mind as you go, because you want to be doing it based on feedback. You have your theory at the beginning for what you want to do, and then that should be adjusted as time goes on. So as we look at these, as we deliver some of the stories up higher, there should be some that we've forgotten about that should creep in. There should be other ones that are deemed to be irrelevant, and they should go back out. So we try and make our proposals actually at the beginning, I wouldn't say as vague as possible, but we want to make them vague in terms of features. So when we sit down, whether you're doing a formal proposal or whether you're sitting down with your team to describe things, try and describe everything in terms of the outcomes and goals that you desire, and avoid the urge to put the features in. Because what's happening is you're locking yourself into a particular scope and solution when, if we go back, it's just like we don't really know what we should be building. We may know what problems we want to solve, and we may have a hint, but you want to set yourself up for success so that we can swap stories around. So for example, an example of this would be, like, one thing that may come across your desk would be like, hey, we need an app, and it's very precisely described. This thing is going to have a multi-user chat room with a live stream, and there's going to be role-playing, and we're going to have threaded discussions. How long is that going to take? It's a difficult question to answer, and we know that we can break it down in terms of estimates. But what we want to do is be able to allow the team to observe the progress, but leave the stakeholder in control of what they really want to do. And don't let them lock themselves in to making those sorts of hard descriptions up front. It's okay to have a vision, but maybe rephrase that in a way, and instead get it in writing to guide the project in terms of wanting collaboration between different configurations of participants. Use the word chat if you have to, but a variety of both spontaneous and thoughtful interactions. So leave room for success. These two things, when we look at the both of them together, it looks fairly hopeless. Because it's just like, if we can't estimate and we don't know what we're building, then how is there any hope? The truth is, the two of them actually play fairly well off of each other. You can use both of these two to your advantage. The first one with the aggregation, so that you can start to see the trend even in the face of uncertainty. And the second with flexibility. This is taken one of two ways. If we can get to conscious incompetence, and if we can all admit as a team, including the product owners, is like, this is going to change. We don't know how it's going to turn out. Then the second one can actually help. If everybody can admit that we don't know what we should build, that means that our scope is flexible. And the two things that we can trade are time and budget, which are linked together, and scope. And most of the time, we don't get a chance to boost time and budget. Once in a while, you do, and you get an extension, but it's a big, chunky one. What we want to do instead is scope the entire time, which means way up front is where we're going to be setting the expectations. And so for setting expectations, this is one of our third truths, is that negotiation on that scope, it's futile without quantitative facts about the future. What we'll see, you've probably encountered this. You'll have the development team that you can sense, the development or design team has the sense that they're just like, this thing's never going to ship on time. You'll hear the pessimism. It's like, there's no way. Those 3 words. And it's like, there's no way. And it's such valuable data because in that frame, we've rarely seen the development team be wrong, much to our chagrin. And it's just like, it's true. So the sooner the worst thing that you can do, which is exactly what I tried to do, is try to cheer them up. Try and talk about the bright sides of how it could possibly go right. It's a terrible idea. Instead, what we want to do is, where can we find the data? Because we know our gut instincts on this. These are professionals who have seen these things time and time again. Where can we find the actual data that gives us the evidence and then have the flexibility to let the client make a decision? So have you guys seen the cone of uncertainty? This is the way that a lot of times projects are described in terms of estimates. We start here, like at the very beginning of the project, somebody comes to you and says, hey, I have an idea for an app for managing recipes or an app for tracking your fitness. And it's going to do X and Y and Z. About how much is that going to cost to build? And the answer is somewhere between $3,000, if you can use something out of the box, to about $3 million, depending on how custom and elaborate everything is going to be. And the cone of uncertainty describes that over time, as you do more and more estimation, you learn more and more about it, you get more and more certain about exactly how much time and how much it's going to cost until you wind up here, which is the end. This is where it's shipped and finished. And surprise, you find out exactly how much it actually costs, because that's the amount that just got spent and the amount of time that it just took. The problem is, of course, here it's too late. So this is where it's like, it's, very small sense of, yeah, it's more like the cone of shame, where it's just like saying up front, we have no idea. And the thing that's bad about it is that it's passive. The red dot is fixed, and it's a victim position. It is where we're trying to estimate this thing, and we'll find out at the end if we're right. We may have started up here, which rarely happens, or we may have started down here, which is more likely because we like to say the things that people want to hear. So the way that we can look at this, the better way to think about this is that this is flexible. Really what we're steering, we're not marching a long time, but we can move this around anywhere we want if we have the roles right, if we have the expectation right, and if we have the willpower right. So teamwork, collaboration, and really both sides being in it together. So one of the biggest things that I do is pay attention to the quality of the interactions. Listen to the words that are being spoken in the stakeholder meetings. Are there terms like we that are being used, and we look at velocity, or is there terms more like I and you? Those things are the hints as to whether this dot is going to be fixed and prone to failure, or whether things are flexible and say, like, how are we going to figure out how to make the most out of the useful time remaining? And here's how we can shift. The important way of shifting that is balancing the control in the relationship. So we need to acknowledge, we don't know exactly what's going to come together that's in the backlog. And so if you, in the position a lot of times of the product owners, the development team that's implementing this wields a tremendous amount of control. That poor product owner is sitting there who is accountable to other stakeholders, and basically whether or not this team is able to deliver on time and on budget determines their success. And it feels like an extremely passive role. So again, what we try and do is we take these points here, and what we can do is begin to observe the velocity of how we start to add these up. So what we want to do is gather our data and gather our facts. The facts that we have, and again, if we're trying to keep these as unbiased as possible, keep the developers in isolation when they estimate, try and keep any expectations away. So if the thing's really a 5, you want it to come out as a 5. If it's really an 8 or a 13 or unestimatable, you want that. If they need to break it up, you want that. Try not to destroy their ability to say, oof, this is really uncomfortable, and this is going to be a lot bigger than we thought. We want that data, because through that data, that's how we're going to get freedom. So here what we can do is, after these stories are in play, and we go through, as these get delivered, and we complete this story, which we estimated at 5 points, which we know is not accurate, and we deliver it, and it gets accepted by the stakeholder, and we deliver the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And what we can begin to see is these are the backlog of stories that got accepted. So this is an amazing, this is the data that we're looking for in terms of our past performance. So each one of these here, we've been careful to have, first we craft each story so that it's really both parties working together on it. It's both the person who is the visionary for what the project should do and the technical and design minds that know how that might best take shape given the talents and tools of the team. So first we craft what that individual story is, then we estimate it, prioritize it, and developers estimate it in isolation. We're trying to get the truth, the ugly truth, not anything that has any sort of bias. And then they work on it, and it gets delivered to the client in a way that we only get credit for these points if it actually got accepted by the client. And that means that the client has to, that product owner has to really try it. Like the other thing that we look out for that we've seen as a symptom is if you see, what was it, one of our developers said, we know for sure if we see about 5 stories accepted in the space of about 30 seconds. You know, it's like, that's the sign that it's like, all right, we don't trust this. It's not good data. We don't know that this is really accepted. So if our product owner's in a hurry and they just say like, all right, all these deliveries, and they're like, all right, yep, accept, 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 accept. It feels like they're doing us a favor where it's just like, yep, you're all good. I'm sure that's fine. But in reality, what happens if we're not really involved in this together, then we discover more stories later where you go back and you see, this wasn't really quite what I had into mind. So if we're doing all this right, we can see 11 points this week, 12 points this week, 11 points, 11 points. This one's actually way too consistent. It almost looks fake. So usually what's more common is to see like an 8 and a 13 and things like that and things bouncing around. Calculating velocity, it only works, it's tricky. We have to get several things to come together for this to be valuable and not just kind of a rubber stamp number. But we have to have the time boxes to be consistent. In other words, if you're doing a sprint as being 1 week and measuring that, and if sometimes it's 2 weeks, if sometimes it's 1 week, or if there's a gap in between, the data gets worse. The team size needs to stay relatively consistent too. If people are going in and out of the team, the data gets worse. Points need to be unbiased, stories need to be written by both parties, and stories are actually accepted by the stakeholder and not by the developer. So when we do all that and we get the average velocity of, let's say, 11 points, now we can look at all the backlog of stories that are remaining and say, the last list was the ones that are done. These are the stories that are remaining. And we can confidently say, all right, if we have 3 weeks of budget left, now we know the data says, and this is the way that we phrase it, the data says that we're going to get to here, and we're not going to get to do these. So what do we do at our planning session now? And this is where the control has to pass to the navigator. This is the data. It's like, terribly sorry, we had a 90-degree slide and slid like all the way to the opposite side of the road. We've lost a ton of momentum. What do we do now? You know, and this is where that feeling of control that the stakeholders have. When you walk into a meeting, we've been in situations before where we've had to walk into a meeting and say 30% of the scope needs to be cut, and usually early on in the project. And when the stakeholders feel that real data is being gathered that's not biased, and this is just the truth of how things are going, every single time we see those stakeholders with the ability to be absolutely brutal with their backlog and say, you know what, this thing that we've been talking about that is super critical, let's save that for phase 2, or let's simplify this. And the entire team can breathe a sigh of relief as we can see like, all right, we can see that this is actually realistic. And we go from a team saying like, this is never going to come in on time, to them coming out of a meeting, a planning meeting, and saying like, yeah, I feel actually really comfortable about this. So uncomfortable truth again. Your job will be in trouble if it is not delivered on time and on budget. And this is scary. Again, we're adding up the previous ones, where knowing these above, this one is slightly terrifying. This is kind of part of that art of diplomacy. So this is a chart of what the various backlogs look like for, this is what a lot of teams' charts sometimes look like without the right kind of control in here. This is not what you want at all. And this is something that I pulled off of the web. And what we see, the total size of the bar is the total number of points that are in the entire backlog, all the things that we're thinking of doing. And what we see is that the bar keeps on going up and up and up and up as time goes on. The light blue is the amount of work that's actually gotten done. So what's indisputable is that the team is getting work done, for sure. The problem is that the amount of work that there is to do is increasing at least as fast as the team is working on it. And things are sitting down here in all sorts of different states. We have lots of stories. There's many stories that are finished as accepted, yet that bar doesn't seem to get that much thicker or thinner. So we're measuring, but we don't know we don't see where we're going. We can't see forward at all. So it doesn't help us in terms of planning. The classic question is going to be, how long until we're finished? And there's no way to estimate this. What we wind up having to do in this situation is say, 4 more weeks, or something like that, which is a single estimate, which it's going to be wrong. So again, how do we get to more, something that's more consistent? This is what we're really looking for. And this is where the big thing, of course, is that this height of the bars stay relatively consistent. So this was a project that we had to do that was on a hard deadline. It coincided with a semester start where it was going to be used at universities. So I forget exactly what the day was, but there was a particular date in August where it has to be live at that time because that's when all the students show up. So there's no negotiation on time, which means that there's almost no negotiation on cost either. So what I don't want to give you the picture of is that the scope was constant. There was actually a tremendous amount of churn in the number of features. But what we see is that the team, and this is teamwork, it's not one side or the other, but both parts of the team, both the strategic product side and the execution side, work together to figure out every single meeting when there was more stories that needed to be added, how do we take a couple out? Or when things change and say hey, we absolutely need to have this discussion forum. What needs to come out instead? Or what can we simplify? Instead of doing the fancy version of this, can we do the simpler version of this? And so what we see is that the stories never get out of whack. There's this constant discipline of trying to make sure that every story is cleaned up and delivered quickly. And again, it's this hunger for raw data. Because what happens is when you're armed with this data and you go into that client stakeholder meeting, that planning meeting, and you say, here's our consistent velocity, what the data lets you do is it lets your team prove that you're making steady progress. When you see a backlog that shows this kind of consistency, that engine gives your management confidence that everybody's working consistently, things are getting delivered consistently. And with this, what that lets them do, since they feel empowered of this backlog is theirs, and what do you want to change and what do you want to remove, that gives them the freedom to say, let's trim this or cut that. And again, we can't accomplish these things just with process. The process enables it, but a lot of it is people understanding that we are codependent, and it's much more like the random rally car race than it is like any sort of explicit planning process. So this is my brief summary of the Scrum technique that we use. And you can use Kanban to do this. You could use any of the Agile methodologies. You don't even need a specific methodology, to be perfectly honest. If you have people in the right roles and you're measuring the things that are difficult to estimate and using the outcomes, you could do it with Post-its on a wall and just counting up the Post-its. It wouldn't even necessarily have a name, which ones are done or which ones are not done. But these are what we see as the simplest description of the important parts of Scrum for project management. So the last one is that, and this is an important one, is as we look at that backlog, and that hard deadline, if we go back and take a look at this, what do you do? There's the point of control at which first, the team starts to get the grasp of story writing and say all right, I understand now. It's this is a complete chunk of functionality that has value. We're delivering it. And it's this is a great way to have a souped up to-do list. That gives a sense of power. The next thing that we measure is the estimation and see, all right, I can start to get a handle on hey, there's velocity. And then usually the third level is how do we use the velocity for planning? And how do we use the velocity? A very natural thing that happens is the stakeholders shift to how do we control the velocity? And it shifts into all right, if 11 points per week is good, that means we always need 11 points per week or else the project's in trouble. So the next week you come in and it's an 8 and it's just why is it only an 8? And it's it's very natural. As some weeks are going to be 8, some are going to be 13. We can observe, but as soon as we start to try and perturb it, we're going to get in trouble one way or the other. You can imagine the psychology where it's just like if you tell that team it needs to be an 11 each week, one of two things are going to happen. They're either going to work overtime to try and get all that work done, but that's awful and hard in the long run. What's more likely is they're going to change their estimates and say, if we need 11 points this week, and this isn't a deceptive thing, but it's subconscious, point estimates are going to creep a little high. If it's a 3 or 5, we're going to give it a 5. If it's a 5 or an 8, we're going to give it an 8. And this can really start to inflate. And what happens is it's really losing its value as a planning tool. You're still getting less and less done because the point values are inflating. It's not like you're accomplishing more. So the working overtime will ultimately kill you. You know, it's like we're all professionals and in this for the long haul. And so one of the important things is like that observance of the data and saying it's the end of the week. And it's like our team, we need to treat each other like professional athletes, which is basically you don't train all the time, you get rest. If we want our teams to be in their top creative form, they need to go out and play, they need to go play with their dogs and their families, and come back fresh so that you can execute really well the following week. There's a time and a place for working late hours, but those should be for the rare occurrences where the team's very psyched to do it, and not something where we're trying to squeeze out velocity because we're unwilling to part with a feature or two. And the earlier we can get that data and do that, and have that level of collaboration, the better. Otherwise, we wind up with burnout. So observe, present hard evidence, and then leave the stakeholders in control of the decisions. Those are some of the biggest lessons. Thanks.
We have a couple minutes for questions.
Great.
If you have questions, the talk box, and I'll let you throw it. My game is lousy, and y'all are sitting way back there.
Nobody's going to want to ask a question if they know ahead of time that they're going to get something thrown at them. We will pass the talk box. Does anybody have any specific stories or questions or anything to share? It's like we as teams always learn from each other, so I'm grateful to hear any sort of insights that you have from your own teams or questions that you have in terms of how we handled something in particular or what we're struggling with at this time, things like that. Any questions at all? Cool.
Excellent.
All right.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you so
Scott.
much, Bevan.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Please do